Section 52 of The Red and the Black by Stendhal, translated by Horace Barnett Samuel. This Librivox recording is in the public domain, read by Peter Dan. Chapter 52, The Discussion. The Republic. For one man today who will sacrifice everything for the public welfare, there are thousands and millions who think of nothing except their enjoyments and their vanity. One is requested in Paris by reason of the qualities not of one's self, but of one's carriage. Napoleon, Memorial. The footman rushed in, saying, "Monsieur the Duc de Blank." "Hold your tongue, you are just a fool," said the Duke as he entered. He spoke these words so well and with so much majesty that Julien could not help thinking this great person's accomplishments were limited to the science of snubbing a lackey. Julien raised his eyes and immediately lowered them. He had so fully appreciated the significance of the new arrival that he feared that his look might be an indiscretion. The Duke was a man of 50, dressed like a dandy, and with a jerky walk. He had a narrow head with a large nose, and a face that jutted forward. It would have been difficult to have looked at the same time more insignificant. His arrival was the signal for the opening of the meeting. Julien was sharply interrupted in his physiognomical observations by de la Mole's voice. "I present to you Monsieur the Abbé Sorel," said the Marquis. "He is gifted with an astonishing memory. It is scarcely an hour since I spoke to him of the mission by which he might be honoured, and he has learned the first page of the Quotidienne by heart in order to give proof of his memory." "Ah, foreign news of that poor N," said the master of the house. He took up the paper eagerly and looked at Julien in a manner rendered humorous by his own self-importance. "Speak, monsieur," he said to him. The silence was profound. All eyes were fixed on Julien. He recited so well that the Duke said at the end of 20 lines, "That is enough." The little man, who looked like a boor, sat down. He was the president, for he had scarcely taken his place before he showed Julien a card table and signed to him to bring it near him. Julien established himself at it with writing materials. He counted 12 persons seated round the green tablecloth. "Monsieur Sorel," said the Duke, "retire into next room. You will be called." The master of the house began to look very anxious. "The shutters are not shut," he said to his neighbour in a semi-whisper. "It is no good looking out of the window," he stupidly cried to Julien. "So here I am, more or less mixed up in a conspiracy," thought the latter. "Fortunately, it is not one of those which lead to the Place de Grève. Even though there were danger, I owe this and even more to the Marquis, and should be glad to be given the chance of making up for all the sorrow which my madness may one day occasion him." While thinking of his own madness and his own unhappiness, he regarded the place where he was in such a way as to imprint it upon his memory forever. He then remembered for the first time that he had never heard the lackey tell the name of the street, and that the Marquis had taken a fiacre, which he never did in the ordinary way. Julien was left to his own reflections for a long time. He was in a salon upholstered with red velvet, with large pieces of gold lace. A large ivory crucifix was on the console table, and a gilt-edged, magnificently bound copy of M. de Maistre's book The Pope was on the mantelpiece. Julien opened it so as not to appear to be eavesdropping. From time to time they talked loudly in the next room. At last the door was opened, and he was called in. "Remember, gentlemen," the president was saying, "that from this moment we are talking in the presence of the Duke of Blank. This gentleman," he said, pointing to Julien, "is a young acolyte devoted to our sacred cause, who by the aid of his marvellous memory will repeat quite easily our very slightest words." "It is your turn to speak, monsieur," he said, pointing to the paternal-looking personage who wore 3 or 4 waistcoats. Julien thought it would have been more natural to have called him the gentleman in the waistcoats. He took some paper and wrote a great deal. At this juncture the author would have liked to have put a page of dots. That, said his publisher, would be clumsy, and in the case of so light a work, clumsiness is death. "Politics," replied the author, "is a stone tied round the neck of literature, which submerges it in less than 6 months. Politics in the midst of imaginative matter is like a pistol shot in the middle of a concert. The noise is racking without being energetic. It does not harmonise with the sound of any instrument. These politics will give mortal offence to one half of the readers, and will bore the other half, who will have already read the ideas in question as set out in the morning paper in its own drastic manner. "If your characters don't talk politics," replied the publisher, "they cease to be Frenchmen of 1830, and your book is no longer a mirror, as you claim." Julien's record ran to 26 pages. Here is a very diluted extract, for it has been necessary to adopt the invariable practice of suppressing those ludicrous passages whose violence would have seemed either offensive or intolerable. See the Gazette des Tribunaux. The man with the waistcoats and the paternal expression, he was perhaps a bishop, often smiled, and then his eyes, which were surrounded with a floating forest of eyebrows, assumed a singular brilliance and an unusually decided expression. This personage, whom they made speak first before the Duke, but what Duke is it, thought Julien to himself, with the apparent object of expounding various points of view and fulfilling the functions of an advocate general, appeared to Julien to fall into the uncertainty and lack of definiteness with which those officials are so often taxed. During the course of the discussion, the Duke went so far as to reproach him on this score. After several sentences of morality and indulgent philosophy, the man in the waistcoats said, "Noble England, under the guiding hand of a great man, the immortal Pitt, has spent 40 milliards of francs in opposing the Revolution. If this meeting will allow me to treat so melancholy a subject with some frankness, England fails to realise sufficiently that in dealing with a man like Bonaparte, especially when they have nothing to oppose him with except a bundle of good intentions, there is nothing decisive except personal methods." "Ah, praising assassination again," said the master of the house anxiously. "Spare us your sentimental sermons," cried the president angrily. His boar-like eyes shone with a savage brilliance. "Go on," he said to the man with the waistcoats. The cheeks and the forehead of the president became purple. "Noble England," replied the advocate general, "is crushed today, for each Englishman, before paying for his own bread, is obliged to pay the interest on 40 milliards of francs which were used against the Jacobins. She has no more Pitt." "She has the Duke of Wellington," said a military personage, looking very important. "Please, gentlemen, silence!" exclaimed the president. "If we are still going to dispute, there is no point in having Monsieur Sorel in." "We know that Monsieur has many ideas," said the Duke irritably, looking at the interrupter, who was an old Napoleonic general. Julien saw that these words contained some personal and very offensive allusion. Everybody smiled. The turncoat general appeared beside himself with rage. "There is no longer a Pitt, gentlemen," went on the speaker, with all the despondency of a man who has given up all hope of bringing his listeners to reason. "If there were a new Pitt in England, you would not dupe a nation twice over by the same means. That's why a victorious general, a Bonaparte, will be henceforth impossible in France," exclaimed the military interrupter. On this occasion neither the president nor the Duke ventured to get angry, though Julien thought he read in their eyes that they would very much like to have done so. They lowered their eyes, and the Duke contented himself with sighing in quite an audible manner. But the speaker was put upon his mettle. "My audience is eager for me to finish," he said vigorously, completely discarding that smiling politeness and that balanced diction that Julien thought had expressed his character so well. "It is eager for me to finish. It is not grateful to me for the efforts I am making to offend nobody's ears, however long they may be. Well, gentlemen, I will be brief. I will tell you in quite common words. England has not got a sou with which to help the good cause. If Pitt himself were to come back, he would never succeed with all his genius in duping the small English landowners, for they know that the short Waterloo campaign alone cost them 1 million of francs. As you like clear phrases," continued the speaker, becoming more and more animated, "I will say this to you. Help yourselves, for England has not got a guinea left to help you with, and when England does not pay, Austria, Russia, and Prussia, who will only have courage but have no money, cannot launch more than 1 or 2 campaigns against France. One may hope that the young soldiers who will be recruited by the Jacobins will be beaten in the first campaign, and possibly in the second. But even though I seem a revolutionary in your prejudiced eyes, in the third campaign, In the third campaign, I say, you will have the soldiers of 1794 who are no longer the soldiers enlisted in 1792. At this point interruption broke out simultaneously from 3 or 4 quarters. "Monsieur," said the President to Julien, "go and make a précis in the next room of the beginning of the report which you have written out." Julien went out, to his great regret. The speaker was just dealing with the question of probabilities which formed the usual subject for his meditations. "They are frightened of my making fun of them," he thought. When he was called back, M. de la Mole was saying with a seriousness which seemed quite humorous to Julien, who knew him so well, "Yes, gentlemen, one finds the phrase, 'Is it God, table, or tub?' especially applicable to this unhappy people." "It is God," exclaims the writer of fables. It is to you, gentlemen, that this noble and profound phrase seems to apply. Act on your own initiative, and noble France will appear again, almost such as our ancestors made her, and as our own eyes have seen her before the death of Louis XVI. England execrates disgraceful Jacobinism as much as we do, or at any rate her noble lords do. Without English gold, Austria and Prussia would only be able to give battle 2 or 3 times. Would that be sufficient to ensure a successful occupation like the one which M. de Richelieu so foolishly failed to exploit in 1817? I do not think so. At this point there was an interruption which was stifled by the hushes of the whole room. It came again from the old imperial general, who wanted the blue ribbon and wished to figure among the authors of the secret note. "I do not think so," replied M. de la Mole, after the uproar had subsided. He laid stress on the "I" with an insolence which charmed Julien. "That's a pretty piece of acting," he said to himself, as he made his pen almost keep pace with the Marquis's words. M. de la Mole annihilated the 20 campaigns of the turncoat with a well-turned phrase. "It is not only on foreign powers," continued the Marquis in a more even tone, "on whom we shall be able to rely for a new military occupation. All those young men who write inflammatory articles in the Globe will provide you with 3,000 or 4,000 young captains, among whom you may find men with the genius, but not the good intentions, of a Kleber, a Hoche, a Jourdan, a Pichegru." "We do not know how to glorify him," said the President. "He should have been immortalized." "Finally, it is necessary for France to have 2 parties," went on M. de la Mole, "but 2 parties, not merely in name, but with clear-cut lines of cleavage. Let us realize what has got to be crushed. On the one hand, the journalists and the electors, in a word, public opinion, youth, and all that admire it. While it is stupefying itself with the noise of its own vain words, we have certain advantages of administrating the expenditure of the budget." At this point there was another interruption. "As for you, monsieur," said M. de la Mole to the interrupter with an admirable haughtiness and ease of manner, "you do not spend if the words choke you, but you devour the 40,000 francs put down to you in the state budget and the 80,000 which you receive from the civil list. Well, monsieur, since you force me to it, I will be bold enough to take you for an example. Like your noble ancestors who followed St. Louis to the Crusade, you ought, in return for those 120,000 francs, to show us at any rate a regiment, a company. Why, what am I saying? Say half a company, even if it only had 50 men, ready to fight and devoted to the good cause to the point of risking their lives in its service. You have nothing but lackeys, who in the event of a rebellion would frighten you yourselves. Throne, church, nobility are liable to perish tomorrow, gentlemen, so long as you refrain from creating in each department a force of 500 devoted men. Devoted, I mean, not only with all the French courage, but with all the Spanish constancy. Half of this force ought to be composed of our children, our nephews, of real gentlemen, in fact. Each of them will have beside him not a little talkative bourgeois ready to hoist the tricolor cockade if 1815 turns up again, but a good, frank and simple peasant like Catilineur. Our gentleman will have educated him. It will be his own foster brother, if it is possible. Let each of us sacrifice the 1/5 of his income in order to form this little devoted force of 500 men in each department. Then you will be able to reckon on a foreign occupation. The foreign soldier will never penetrate even as far as Dijon if he is not certain of finding 500 friendly soldiers in each department. The foreign kings will only listen to you when you are in a position to announce to them that you have 20,000 gentlemen ready to take up arms in order to open to them the gates of France. The service is troublesome, you say. Gentlemen, it is the only way of saving our lives. There is war to the death between the liberty of the press and our existence as gentlemen. Become manufacturers, become peasants, or take up your guns. Be timid if you like, but do not be stupid. Open your eyes. Form your battalions, I would say to you in the words of the Jacobin songs. Some noble Gustavus Adolphus will then be found, who, touched by the imminent peril of the monarchical principle, will make a dash 300 leagues from his own country, and will do for you what Gustavus did for the Protestant princes. Do you want to go on talking without acting? In 50 years' time there will be only presidents or republics in Europe, and not one king, and with those letters ROI you will see the last of the priests and the gentlemen. I can see nothing but candidates paying court to squalid majorities. It is no use your saying that at the present time France has not a single accredited general who is universally known and loved, that the army is only known and organised in the interest of the throne and the church, and that it has been deprived of all its old troopers, while each of the Prussian and Austrian regiments count 50 non-commissioned officers who have seen fire. 200,000 young men of the middle classes are spoiling for war. "A truce to disagreeable truths," said a grave personage in a pompous tone. He was apparently a very high ecclesiastical dignitary, for M. de la Mole smiled pleasantly instead of getting angry, a circumstance which greatly impressed Julien. "A truce to unpleasant truths. Let us resume, gentlemen. The man who needs to have a gangrened leg cut off would be ill-advised to say to his surgeon, 'This disease is very healthy.' If I may use the metaphor, gentlemen, the noble Duke of Blank is our surgeon." So the great words have at last been uttered, thought Julien. It is towards the blank that I shall gallop tonight. End of section 52.